In the harsh wilderness of 1870s Montana, where survival depends on strength and silence, Sarah Matthews carries grief heavier than her worn leather satchel. After losing everything that mattered back east, she's come to the frontier's edge, seeking not fortune but simply a place where her broken heart can rest. The mountain trading post offers work, cleaning and cooking, honest labor that keeps her hands busy while her mind wrestles with sorrow that seems endless as the vast sky above. Then she meets Jacob Stone, a weathered mountain man whose gentle eyes see straight through her careful composure to the pain she's trying so desperately to hide. His voice is rough from years of solitude, but his words carry unexpected tenderness when he quietly tells her, "I see your sadness. Let me be the man who makes you smile again." But can two people scarred by loss really heal each other's wounds? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stagecoach had deposited Sarah at the crossroads 3 days prior, along with her single leather satchel and a heart so heavy it seemed to drag against her ribs with each labored breath. The driver had pointed toward a narrow trail winding into pine-covered hills, muttering something about Murphy's Place before snapping his reins and disappearing in a cloud of dust that settled like judgment on her black traveling dress. Now she stood before a weathered log building that served as both trading post and way station for travelers, foolish or desperate enough to venture into Montana Territory's unforgiving wilderness. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Murphy's Trading Post, supplies, lodging, fair dealing," in letters faded by countless seasons, but still proud in their declarations. Sarah's fingers found the crumpled letter in her coat pocket, Margaret's final words written in the careful script their mother had taught them both during long winter evenings in Philadelphia. "Come west, dear sister," the letter had pleaded. "Find what peace you can in God's wild country, for civilized society has shown you none." Margaret's consumption had claimed her before Sarah could make the journey, leaving only this letter and the desperate need to escape the whispers that followed her through every street in her former life. The trading post's heavy wooden door swung open at her touch, revealing an interior that smelled of leather, tobacco, and something indefinably wholesome. Perhaps fresh bread or coffee beans. Shelves lined the walls, packed with supplies that spoke of lives lived far from the conveniences of eastern cities. Flour sacks, canned goods, woolen blankets, ammunition and tools, whose purposes Sarah could only guess at. "You'll be the Matthews woman," came a voice from behind the counter. Sarah turned to see a sturdy woman of perhaps 50 years. Her graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, her eyes kind but measuring. "I'm Bridget Murphy. Got word from the stage line you'd be coming." Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of how she must appear after 3 days of travel, dusty, rumpled, and carrying the unmistakable weight of recent tragedy. "Yes, ma'am. I'm hoping you might have work for someone willing to earn her keep." Miss Murphy studied her with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to taking the measure of strangers. "Can you cook without poisoning folks? Clean without breaking what shouldn't be broke? Handle yourself around men who ain't seen a decent woman in months?" "I can, ma'am." "Then you'll do rooms upstairs, second door, meals with the household. Work starts at dawn, pays modest but fair." Mrs. Murphy's expression softened slightly. "What brings a lady like you to the edge of nowhere, if you don't mind my asking?" Sarah's hand instinctively went to the gold wedding band she still wore. Though she'd never been married, the ring had belonged to her sister Margaret, a symbol of the engagement that had been broken when Margaret's illness became apparent. Sarah had worn it since Margaret's funeral, a talisman against a world that seemed determined to strip away everything she held dear. "I needed a place to start over," Sarah said simply. Mrs. Murphy nodded as if this explanation required no elaboration. "Plenty of folks come here for fresh starts. The frontier don't care much about what you were before, only about what you're willing to become." That first night, Sarah lay on a narrow bed in a room barely large enough to hold it, listening to the sounds of a world so different from Philadelphia's familiar chaos. Instead of carriage wheels on cobblestones, she heard wind through pine boughs. Instead of street vendors hawking their wares, She heard the distant call of some night bird she couldn't name. The silence between these natural sounds felt vast and somehow cleansing, as if the very air here might wash away the stains that civilized society had marked her with. Through her small window she could see a cabin set apart from the main buildings, smoke rising from its chimney in a straight line against the star-filled sky. Mrs. Murphy had mentioned a man named Jacob Stone, who sometimes traded at the post, who lived alone in those hills and bothered no one. "Good man," she'd said, with the brevity that seemed to characterize frontier praise. "Keeps to himself mostly, but he's there when folks need him." Sarah pulled Margaret's letter from beneath her pillow, reading it once more by moonlight filtering through her window. Her sister's words seemed different here, less desperate and more hopeful. "Perhaps in that vast country, dear Sarah, you'll find room enough for your heart to heal." Outside, the mountain wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, indifferent to human sorrow, but somehow offering the promise that such vastness might hold space for even the deepest grief to eventually find rest. Dawn came early to the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that no eastern sunrise had ever achieved. Sarah woke to the sound of Mrs. Murphy moving about downstairs, the comfortable clatter of someone beginning a day's honest work. She dressed quickly in the practical grey dress she'd brought for working, pinning her dark hair back in a simple style that would stay neat through whatever tasks awaited her. The trading post's kitchen occupied the back half of the main floor, dominated by a large cast-iron stove that radiated welcome warmth against the morning chill. Mrs. Murphy stood at a work table, her sleeves rolled up as she kneaded bread dough with the rhythmic efficiency of long practice. "Coffee's on the stove," she said without looking up. "Cup's on the shelf there, you'll want it strong. Mountain air's thin, but the work ain't." Sarah poured herself a cup of the dark brew, inhaling its rich aroma. It tasted nothing like the delicate tea she'd favored in Philadelphia, but it carried a robust warmth that seemed to reach into her very bones. She stood at the kitchen's single window, looking out at a world so different from anything she'd ever known. That's when she first saw him. Jacob Stone emerged from the tree line like something conjured from the wilderness itself. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the unhurried confidence of a man completely at home in his surroundings. His dark hair was longer than fashion would dictate back east, his beard neat but full. He wore buckskin pants and a wool shirt that had seen many seasons, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that spoke of strength, earned rather than assumed. "That'll be Jacob," Mrs. Murphy said, following Sarah's gaze. "Comes by most mornings for coffee and whatever news there is. Good man to have as a friend, if you're inclined toward friendship." Sarah watched as Jacob approached the trading post's front entrance. Something about his measured pace suggested a man who'd learned that hurrying rarely improved outcomes, that patience was often the most practical virtue in a land that demanded both strength and wisdom. The front door opened with its familiar creak, and Jacob's voice carried into the kitchen, a deep, pleasant baritone roughened by years of sparse conversation.
"Morning, Bridget."
"Smells like you've outdone yourself again with that bread." "Morning yourself, Jacob. Come on back. There's someone you should meet." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as footsteps approached. She turned from the window, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. It had been so long since she'd been introduced to anyone, so long since she'd needed to present herself as anything other than a woman in mourning. Jacob appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped, his grey eyes taking in Sarah's presence with a directness that wasn't rude, but wasn't casual either. He seemed to see everything in that moment. Her carefully composed posture, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers worried at something in her pocket. "Jacob Stone," Mrs. Murphy said. "Meet Sarah Matthews. She's come to help out around here, and I suspect she could use some friendly faces in a new place." Jacob stepped forward and extended his hand. "Miss Matthews, welcome to the territory." His handshake was firm but brief, his palm coolest from work. Sarah couldn't imagine. When their eyes met, she felt an unexpected jolt of recognition. Not that she'd seen him before, but that he understood something about her that she hadn't expected anyone to see. "Thank you," she managed. Very different from what I'm used to. Different can be good, he said quietly. Sometimes it's exactly what a person needs. There was something in his voice, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. Sarah found herself studying his face, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into distant horizons, the weathering that came from a life lived largely outdoors. But his eyes held a warmth that seemed to recognize her own, carefully hidden pain. From his shirt pocket, Jacob withdrew a small wooden cross, worn smooth by handling. He turned it over in his fingers as he spoke, an unconscious gesture that suggested it brought him comfort. The cross was simple, hand-carved, and polished to a soft sheen by what must have been years of such absent-minded handling. "Mrs. Murphy makes the best coffee between here and Denver," he said, accepting a cup from their hostess. "And she's got wisdom enough to share with folks who need it." "Jacob's being modest," Mrs. Murphy said with obvious fondness. "He's the one Mo's come to when they need help, whether it's a cabin raising or finding someone lost in the woods." Jacob's discomfort with the praise was evident in the way he shifted his weight, focusing his attention on his coffee. Sarah recognized the gesture, the instinctive deflection of someone unaccustomed to being the center of attention, someone who preferred action to recognition. "How long have you lived here?" Sarah asked, surprised by her own curiosity. "Going on 8 years now," Jacob replied. "Came here looking for peace and quiet. Found more than I bargained for." The way he said it suggested layers of meaning Sarah didn't yet understand, stories that would take time and trust to uncover. The days settled into a rhythm that Sarah found unexpectedly comforting. She rose with the sun, helped Miss Murphy prepare meals for the occasional travelers and local men who stopped by for supplies and conversation, and spent her afternoons cleaning and organizing the trading post's diverse inventory. The work was honest and straightforward, so different from the complicated social maneuvering that had dominated her Philadelphia life. Jacob had begun stopping by more frequently, though he always had practical reasons, needing supplies, checking on weather conditions with other travelers, or helping Mrs. Murphy with repairs around the post. Sarah noticed how the older woman's face would brighten when Jacob appeared, and how other men deferred to his quiet authority, on matters ranging from which trails were passable to whether the winter would come early. On this particular afternoon, Sarah was sweeping the front porch when Jacob emerged from the trading post, carrying a sack of flour and some canned goods. Instead of heading directly to his horse, he paused at the porch rail, setting down his supplies. "Mind if I ask you something, Miss Matthews?" His voice carried that same gentle directness she was beginning to recognize as distinctly his own. Sarah leaned the broom against the wall, smoothing her apron with nervous hands. "Of course, you've got the look of someone who's traveled a long way to get here. Not just in miles, I mean." His gray eyes studied her face with an intensity that wasn't intrusive, but wasn't casual either. Sometimes when folks are running from something, they keep running even after they've found a place to stop. "Just wondering if you found what you came looking for." The question caught Sarah off guard with its gentle perceptiveness. She'd grown accustomed to people either avoiding the subject of her past entirely, or prying with obvious curiosity. Jacob's approach was different, direct but respectful, offering her the choice of how much to reveal. "I'm not sure I knew what I was looking for," she admitted. "Sometimes you just know you can't stay where you are." Jacob nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. "I came here for similar reasons. Had a life that stopped making sense. Needed to find something different." He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew something small, turning it over in his palm before showing it to her. It was a child's wooden toy horse, carved with obvious care and polished smooth by hand. The craftsmanship was simple but skillful, the kind of work that spoke of love rather than commerce. "I made this for my son," Jacob said quietly. "Back when I had a son to make things for." Sarah felt her breath catch. The simple statement carried such weight of loss that it seemed to hang in the mountain air between them. She understood instinctively that Jacob was sharing something he rarely spoke about, offering her a piece of his own story in response to her guarded revelations. "How old was he?" she asked gently. "4. His name was Daniel." Jacob's thumb traced the wooden horse's mane with unconscious tenderness. Had his mother's eyes and his own way of seeing magic in everything. Used to gallop this little horse all over our cabin, making sound effects that could wake the dead. Sarah could see the memory playing behind Jacob's eyes, a happy memory that had become bittersweet with loss. What happened to them? Fever took them both one winter. Started with Daniel, spread to Mary, before I could get a doctor from town. By the time help came, I was digging graves in frozen ground. His voice remained steady, but Sarah could see the cost of that steadiness in the tension around his eyes. Buried them on the hill behind our old place, then packed what I could carry and headed west. The wooden horse disappeared back into his pocket, but not before Sarah noticed how carefully he handled it, as if it were made of something far more precious than wood. She understood the gesture now, the way he touched it for comfort, the unconscious reaching for it when conversations turned serious. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it more deeply than such words usually conveyed. "Appreciate that. Point is, I reckon we both know something about carrying weight that other folks can't see. Sometimes it helps to know you're not the only one walking around with ghosts." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with the sound of wind through the pines and the distant call of a hawk. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she felt seen, not judged, not pitied, but simply understood by someone who carried his own share of sorrow. "Miss Murphy says you live up in the hills," Sarah said eventually. "Got a cabin about 3 miles north. Built it myself after I got here. It's quiet, peaceful. Good place to think." He paused, then added with careful casualness, "You're welcome to see it sometime if you're curious about how folks live up there." The invitation was offered gently, with no pressure or expectation attached. Sarah recognized it as the gift it was, an offer of friendship from a man who clearly didn't extend such offers lightly. The storm arrived without the courtesy of gradual warning, as mountain weather often did. Sarah had volunteered to walk to the nearby creek to fetch water for Missy Murphy's laundry, a simple task that had become part of her daily routine. The morning had dawned clear and mild, with no hint of the violence that would soon descend from the peaks. She was halfway back to the trading post, carrying 2 heavy buckets, when the first drops began to fall. Within minutes, those drops became a deluge that turned the well-worn path into a treacherous stream of mud and loose rock. The wind rose with frightening intensity, driving rain that stung like needles and made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Sarah struggled forward, her grey wool dress growing heavier with each step as it absorbed the relentless precipitation. The buckets, once manageable, now felt like anchors dragging at her arm. She stumbled, nearly falling, and realized with growing alarm that she could no longer make out familiar landmarks through the storm's fury. The path that had seemed so clear on countless previous walks now disappeared beneath rushing water and debris. Sarah set down the buckets, knowing she needed both hands free to navigate whatever lay ahead. The rain hammered down with such force that breathing became difficult, each inhalation bringing more water than air. She pressed forward, following what she hoped was still the path, but the landscape had transformed into something alien and hostile. Trees that should have been familiar guides became threatening shadows in the storm's grey twilight. The creek, normally a gentle babbling companion, had swollen into a roaring torrent that blocked what she thought was her route home. Panic began to creep into Sarah's chest as she realized she was truly lost. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the temperature was dropping with each passing hour. Her dress, soaked through completely, offered no protection against the mountain cold that could kill as surely as any predator. She took shelter beneath a large pine tree, pressing herself against its trunk and wrapping her arms around her body in a futile attempt to conserve warmth. The wind tore at her carefully pinned hair, sending dark strands whipping across her face. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Sarah felt the full weight of her isolation, the understanding that in this wilderness a person could disappear without a trace. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, time lost meaning in the storm's relentless assault. Sarah's teeth chattered uncontrollably, and she could no longer feel her feet inside her sodden shoes. She began to wonder if this was how her story would end, if she would become another cautionary tale about Ian folk who underestimated the frontier's dangers. Then, through the storm's howling, she heard something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. Her name, called by a voice she recognized, Jacob's voice, strong and sure, despite the wind's attempts to steal it away. Sarah Matthews. He tried to call back, but her voice seemed pitifully small against the storm's roar. Gathering what strength remained, she stumbled away from the tree, following the sound of Jacob's calls. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, and she fell twice before she saw him emerging from the grey curtain of rain like some mythical rescuer. Jacob reached her side in 3 long strides, his strong hands immediately steadying her as she swayed on unsteady feet. His own clothes were soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his head, but his eyes held a fierce determination that cut through her panic like sunlight through storm clouds. "I've got you," he said, his voice close to her ear so she could hear him above the wind. "We need to get you somewhere warm." Without waiting for her response, Jacob swept Sarah up in his arms, cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing at all. She wanted to protest, to insist she could walk, but her body betrayed her with violent shivers that made speech impossible. Jacob carried her through the storm with sure-footed confidence, navigating terrain that had confounded her completely. Sarah pressed her face against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of wet wool and something indefinably masculine that made her feel safer than she had in months. Her grey dress, once neat and practical, now hung in tatters where thorns and branches had torn the fabric during her panicked flight through the underbrush. The careful stitching at the sleeves had given way completely, leaving her arms bare to the cold rain. The dress that had represented her attempt to present herself as a capable, respectable woman now marked her as someone who needed rescuing, someone whose carefully maintained composure had been stripped away by forces beyond her control. Through the storm's chaos, Jacob's cabin appeared like a beacon of salvation, solid logs and glowing windows that promised warmth and safety. Sarah had never been so grateful to see human habitation, never so aware of how precious shelter could be in a world that could turn hostile without warning. Jacob's cabin was smaller than Sarah had imagined, but it radiated warmth and comfort in ways that had nothing to do with its size. The main room served as kitchen, living area, and workspace, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and casting dancing shadows across hand-hewn log walls. A fire crackled invitingly, filling the space with golden light that seemed to chase away not just the storm's chill, but some of the darkness Sarah had carried in her heart for so long. "We need to get you out of those wet clothes," Jacob said matter-of-factly, setting her down gently near the fire. "There's a quilt in the chest there, and I'll put some coffee on while you get warm." He turned his back with the unconscious courtesy of a man raised to respect women's modesty, busying himself at the stove, while Sarah peeled away her sodden dress with fingers that still trembled from cold and shock. The grey wool, once her armor against the world's judgment, now lay in a defeated heap on Jacob's floor. Sarah wrapped herself in the quilt Jacob had indicated, and immediately understood why he had suggested it. The covering was extraordinary, not just warm and dry, but beautiful in a way that spoke of countless winter evenings spent in careful, meditative work. The pattern was intricate, composed of deep blues and forest greens that seemed to capture something essential about the mountain landscape. Each stitch was perfectly placed, the work of someone who understood that functional things could also be beautiful. "Did you make this?" she asked, pulling the quilt closer around her shoulders. Jacob glanced over from where he was measuring coffee into a battered tin pot. "Learned from my mother back in Ohio." She said a man living alone needed to know how to make his own comfort. He paused in his work, a shadow crossing his features. "Kept my hands busy during the long nights after Mary and Daniel passed. Gave me something to think about besides what I'd lost." Sarah ran her fingers over the careful stitching, imagining Jacob bent over this work by lamplight, each stitch a small act of healing, a way of creating beauty from the raw materials of survival. The quilt told the story of a man who had refused to let grief diminish his capacity for creating something worthwhile. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I never learned to quilt. My mother always said it was more practical to buy what we needed." "Different worlds," Jacob observed, pouring steaming coffee into 2 tin cups. "Out here you learn to make what you need or do without. Sometimes making it yourself means it fits better anyway." He handed her a cup of coffee, careful not to let his fingers brush hers, though Sarah found herself wishing they might. The coffee was strong and bitter, nothing like the delicate beverages she'd known in Philadelphia, but it sent warmth spreading through her body in waves that felt like salvation. Jacob settled into a chair across from her, maintaining a respectful distance while still staying close enough for conversation. Sarah noticed how he moved through his space with easy familiarity, a man completely at home in surroundings he had shaped with his own hands. Everything in the cabin spoke of thoughtful construction and careful maintenance. Furniture built to last, tools kept sharp and clean, a life organized around practical necessities, but softened by touches of unexpected beauty. "Storm should pass by morning," Jacob said, glancing toward the single window where rain still drummed against thick glass. "Creek'll be high for a few days, but the path back to Murphy's will be clear enough." Sarah nodded, though she found herself in no hurry to return to the trading post. For the first time in months, she felt genuinely safe, wrapped in Jacob's handmade quilt and warmed by his fire. The storm that had seemed so threatening now felt like a blessing in disguise, a force that had stripped away her pretenses and brought her to this place of unexpected sanctuary. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more deeply than the simple words could convey, "for finding me, for bringing me here. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come looking." Jacob's expression grew serious. "Bridget sent word when you didn't come back. Said you'd gone for water and should have been back hours ago." He leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes holding hers. "Thing is, Miss Matthews, I was already on my way to look for you before she asked. Something told me you might need help." The admission hung between them, carrying implications that neither seemed ready to fully explore. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, not from cold or fear this time, but from something altogether more complex and hopeful. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside Jacob's cabin, surrounded by the evidence of his solitary but purposeful life, Sarah felt the first stirrings of something she had thought lost forever. The possibility that shelter could be more than just protection from weather, that it could be a place where two people might create warmth together against all the world's storms. The morning after the storm dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of crystalline air that made every distant peak seem close enough to touch. Sarah had spent the night in Jacob's cabin, sleeping in his bed while he took the floor near the fire, arrangement he had insisted upon with gentle but absolute firmness. She woke to the sound of him moving quietly about the cabin, building up the fire and preparing what smelled like bacon and coffee. Her dress had dried overnight, though it bore the permanent marks of her ordeal, tears that spoke of desperate flight through hostile terrain. When she emerged from behind the blanket Jacob had hung for her privacy, she found him standing at his small window, looking out at a landscape transformed by the storm's passage. "Creeks running high, but the path's clear," he said without turning around. "I can walk you back to Murphy's whenever you're ready." But when Sarah joined him at the window, she saw something that made her forget all about returning to the trading post. Behind Jacob's cabin, carved from the forest with obvious care and planning, lay a garden that took her breath away. Neat rows of vegetables stretched across a cleared patch of earth, each plant precisely spaced and obviously thriving under expert care. "You have a garden," she said, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. Jacob turned to follow her gaze, and she caught something in his expression that might have been pride. "Started it my second year here. Figured if I was going to make this place home, I ought to be able to feed myself properly. Might I see it?" The words came out before Sarah could consider whether such a request was appropriate. Jacob nodded, reaching for two heavy jackets that hung near the door. "Ground'll be soft from the rain." You'll want these boots too. He indicated a pair of worn leather boots that were clearly too large for her, but would protect her feet from the mud. They walked together through the garden rows, and Sarah found herself marveling at the evidence of Jacob's patient skill. Tomatoes climbed sturdy poles with military precision, their vines heavy with fruit in various stages of ripeness. Bean plants wound around supports in spirals that demonstrated both botanical knowledge and artistic sensibility. Squash plants spread their broad leaves in carefully planned patterns that maximized both space and sun exposure. "This is remarkable," Sarah said, kneeling beside a row of carrots whose feathery tops indicated healthy roots developing below. "How did you learn to do this?" "Trial and error mostly. Lost more plants than I saved the first few years." Jacob knelt beside her, pulling a few weeds that had sprouted overnight in the storm's aftermath. "But the land teaches you if you pay attention to what it's trying to tell you." Sarah watched his hands work the soil, noting the gentle precision with which he removed unwanted growth while protecting the plants he intended to nurture. There was something meditative about the work, a rhythm that seemed to connect him to something larger than himself. "My sister Margaret loved gardening," Sarah said, surprised by her own willingness to share the memory. "She said it was the closest thing to magic she'd ever found, putting seeds in dirt and having food appear months later." Jacob nodded, understanding lighting his features. She wasn't wrong. There's something about growing your own food that connects you to the basics of staying alive, makes you grateful for every meal. Without asking permission, Sarah began pulling weeds from the row they knelt beside, matching Jacob's careful technique. The soil was rich and dark, still damp from the storm, but not waterlogged. Her fingers found the rhythm of the work almost immediately, as if some ancestral knowledge was awakening in her hands. "You've done this before," Jacob observed, noting her natural movement. "Margaret taught me when we were girls. We had a small plot behind our house in Philadelphia, before our parents decided it wasn't appropriate for young ladies." Sarah's voice carried a note of old resentment. "They said it made our hands too rough, that it wasn't suitable for women of our station." They worked in comfortable silence for nearly an hour, moving down the rows together in a partnership that felt natural, despite being entirely new. Sarah found herself stealing glances at Jacob's profile as he worked, noting the concentration that creased his brow, the unconscious smile that touched his lips when he discovered a particularly healthy plant. The simple tools Jacob used were well maintained and perfectly suited to their purpose. A small hand cultivator with a worn wooden handle that fit perfectly in the palm, a narrow-bladed weeder that could slip between delicate plants without damage. Each tool showed the patina of regular use and careful maintenance, evidence of a man who understood that good work required good equipment, properly cared for. "This feels right," Sarah said suddenly, then colored at having spoken the thought aloud. Jacob paused in his weeding, looking at her with those perceptive grey eyes. "Working the soil has a way of settling a person's mind. Gives your hands something useful to do while your thoughts find their proper places." 2 weeks passed before Sarah found the courage to ask Jacob the question that had been growing in her mind since that morning in his garden. They had fallen into an easy routine. She would finish her morning duties at the trading post, then walk the familiar path to his cabin where they would work together in companionable silence, sharing the tasks that kept his small homestead running smoothly. On this particular afternoon, as they sat on his front porch sharing coffee and watching the sun begin its descent behind the western peaks, Sarah finally spoke the words that had been weighing on her heart. "You said you came here looking for peace and quiet," she said carefully, "but you never told me what you were running from." Jacob was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she had overstepped some invisible boundary. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories I had clearly spent years trying to bury. "I wasn't always a mountain man," he said, staring out at the landscape that had become his sanctuary. "Used to have a different life entirely. Had a farm in Kansas, A wife who made that farm feel like the center of the universe, and a son who thought his papa could do anything. Sarah waited, sensing that this story needed to unfold in its own time, without prompting or questions that might cause Jacob to retreat back into his customary reticence. Mary was the kind of woman who made everything better just by being there. Jacob continued. She could make a one-room cabin feel like a mansion, could take the simplest ingredients and turn them into meals that would make a man weep with gratitude. And Daniel, his voice softened with a tenderness that made Sarah's chest ache with sympathy. That boy had more life in him than seemed possible for someone so small. Always asking questions, always wanting to help with whatever work needed doing. Jacob reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew something Sarah had never seen before. It was a daguerreotype, the metal surface worn smooth around the edges from handling, the image faded but still clear enough to show a young woman, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, holding a small boy who shared his father's dark hair and serious expression. This was taken the spring before they died, Jacob said, holding the photograph so Sarah could see it clearly. Daniel was 4 then, Mary was 26. We had plans, dreams about expanding the farm, maybe having more children. Thought we had all the time in the world to build the life we wanted. Sarah studied the faces in the photograph, seeing in them the happiness that Jacob had lost. Understanding now the source of the quiet sorrow that sometimes shadowed his eyes. The woman in the image radiated the kind of contentment that came from being exactly where she belonged, while the little boy looked out at the world with the confident curiosity of a child who had never known anything but love and security. What happened? Sarah asked gently. Fever came through that winter, the kind that takes whole families sometimes. Started with Daniel. One day he was running around the cabin, making his toy horses gallop across every surface he could reach. The next he was burning with fever and couldn't keep food down. Jacob's thumb traced the edge of the photograph with unconscious tenderness. Mary nursed him day and night, never leaving his side, never giving up hope, even when it became clear that hope might not be enough. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind through the pines and the distant call of a hawk. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she imagined Jacob watching helplessly as the two people who gave his life meaning slipped away despite all his desperate efforts to save them. She caught it from him, of course. Jacob continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary always said that love meant sharing everything, the good and the bad. I suppose she shared Daniel's fever too, because within a week they were both beyond any help I could give them. Jacob carefully returned the daguerreotype to his pocket, treating it with the reverence due a sacred relic. Sarah understood now why he carried it, why he sometimes touched his pocket in moments of deep thought or strong emotion. It was his way of keeping Mary and Daniel close, of ensuring that their memory traveled with him wherever he went. I buried them on the hill behind our house, he said. Sold the farm to the first buyer who made an offer, packed what I could carry, and started walking west. Didn't stop until I found this place. Didn't build anything permanent until I was sure the ghosts had stopped following me. Sarah reached across the small space between their chairs and placed her hand over his, a gesture of comfort that felt both natural and significant. I'm sorry, Jacob, they sound like they were wonderful. They were everything, he replied simply. And when they were gone, I thought I was done with love, done with caring about anything that could be taken away. Figured it was safer to live alone, to not give my heart any new reasons to break. The morning Jacob appeared at the trading post, carrying wildflowers marked a turning point that both Sarah and Mrs. Murphy recognized immediately, though neither spoke of it directly. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen where Sarah was kneading bread, holding a modest bouquet of mountain blooms with the awkward uncertainty of a man unaccustomed to such gestures. Found these growing near the creek, he said, his usual confidence replaced by something almost boyish. Thought you might like to see them before the first frost takes them. The flowers were simple mountain varieties, Indian paintbrush with its bright red blooms, purple lupine standing tall and stately, and delicate white columbine that seemed too fragile to survive in such rugged country. Jacob had arranged them with surprising care, the colors balanced in a way that suggested an artist's eye, hidden beneath his practical exterior. Sarah felt her breath catch as she accepted the bouquet, her fingers brushing his in the transfer. It had been so long since anyone had given her flowers, so long since she had been the recipient of such thoughtful attention. The blooms carried the fresh scent of mountain meadows and morning dew, a perfume no hothouse arrangement could ever duplicate. "They're beautiful," she said, meaning it more than any polite response should require. "I can't remember the last time someone brought me flowers." Mrs. Murphy, who had been conspicuously busy with inventory in the next room, appeared with a mason jar filled with fresh water. "These'll look lovely on the kitchen table," she announced, with obvious satisfaction. Jacob's got a good eye for what grows wild up in those hills. Over the weeks that followed, Jacob's visits to the trading post became less about supplies and more about spending time with Sarah. He would arrive in mid-morning after completing his essential chores and find ways to make himself useful around the post while engaging Sarah in conversation that grew increasingly personal and comfortable. Sarah found herself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified her. She had believed herself done with such feelings, convinced that her heart had been too thoroughly broken to ever risk opening again. Yet Jacob's gentle presence was awakening something in her that she had thought permanently buried beneath layers of grief and disappointment. One afternoon, as they worked together replacing loose boards on the trading post's front porch, Sarah realized she was humming. Actually humming while she worked. The discovery stopped her short, hammer frozen in mid-swing as she recognized the melody. It was a song Margaret used to sing while gardening, a simple tune their mother had taught them both during childhood summers that now seemed to belong to a different lifetime. "That's a pretty song," Jacob observed, looking up from where he was measuring a board for cutting. "Haven't heard you sing before." Sarah felt color rise in her cheeks. "I didn't realize I was doing it. It's something my sister used to sing. I haven't thought of it in years." "Memory's a strange thing," Jacob said, resuming his measuring with careful precision. "Sometimes it brings back exactly what you need, right when you need it most." They worked in comfortable rhythm, Sarah holding boards steady while Jacob measured and cut, then both working together to position and nail each piece into place. The physical labor felt good. The simple satisfaction of improving something through the work of their own hands. Sarah marveled at how natural it felt to work alongside Jacob, how their movements seemed to complement each other without conscious planning. "You're good at this," Jacob said as Sarah expertly positioned a difficult corner piece. "Most folks from back east wouldn't know which end of a hammer to hold. My father believed his daughters should understand practical things, even if society expected us to pretend otherwise," Sarah replied. "He said a person never knew when such knowledge might prove necessary. Smart man, he was. He would have liked you, I think. He always said the measure of a man wasn't in his words, but in the work he did with his hands and the kindness he showed when no one was watching." Jacob paused in his hammering, looking at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. What would he think about his daughter spending time with a mountain hermit, who talks more to trees than to people? Sarah considered the question seriously. "I think he would see what I see, a man who honors his work, who treats others with respect, who builds things that last and tends things that grow. He would approve." As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Sarah found herself reluctant to see the day end. Jacob packed his tools with the methodical care he brought to everything he did, but she noticed he worked more slowly than usual, as if he too was hesitant to break the spell of their shared afternoon. Sarah discovered the letter quite by accident while tidying Jacob's cabin during one of her regular visits. She had been dusting his small bookshelf, moving aside various practical volumes about farming and wilderness survival, when a folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages of a book about crop rotation and fluttered to the floor. The paper was cream-colored and smooth, clearly not the rough stock Jacob used for practical notes about weather or supplies. Her name was written across the front in his careful handwriting. The letters formed with obvious attention to making them as neat and readable as possible. For a moment, Sarah simply stared at the paper lying at her feet, understanding instinctively that she held something Jacob had never intended for her to see. She should have replaced it immediately, should have respected the privacy that Jacob guarded so carefully. Instead, she found herself unfolding the letter with trembling fingers, driven by a curiosity that overrode her usual respect for boundaries. The words that greeted her made her breath catch in her throat. "Dear Sarah, I have started this letter a dozen times and failed to finish it even once. Words have never come easily to me, and the words I need most seem to be the hardest of all to find. But Mrs. Murphy says that sometimes the most important things are also the most difficult to say, so I will try once more to put on paper what I cannot seem to speak aloud. You have brought something back to my life that I thought was gone forever. When I watch you tend the garden, when I hear you humming while you work, when I see you smile at some small kindness Miss Murphy shows a weary traveler, I remember what it feels like to hope for more than just surviving from one day to the next. I know you carry your own sorrows, and I would never presume to think that my feelings could somehow erase the pain you have endured. But I want you to know that your presence here has been like sunlight after a long winter, warming places in my heart. I had given up for dead. If I were a braver man, I would tell you these things face to face. I would ask if you might consider building a life here, in this wild country, with a man who has little to offer, except a willingness to work hard and a heart that beats faster whenever you are near. But I am not brave enough for such declarations, so instead I write words I may never find the courage to share. Perhaps it is enough that they exist, that somewhere in this cabin there is written proof of what you have come to mean to me. With all my regard and affection, Jacob." Sarah sank into Jacob's chair, the letter trembling in her hands as she read it again, then a third time, hardly daring to believe the words were real. Jacob, who was so careful with his speech, who measured every word before speaking, had poured his heart onto paper with an eloquence that took her breath away. The sound of his boots on the front porch sent her into a panic. She quickly refolded the letter, trying to return it to its hiding place, but Jacob's voice was already at the door. "Sarah, you in there?" "Yes, just finishing up," she called, her voice higher than usual with nervousness. She managed to slip the letter back between the book's pages just as Jacob entered the cabin, carrying an armload of firewood. "Appreciate you keeping the place tidy," he said, stacking the wood beside the fireplace with his usual methodical precision. "Gets easier to let things slide when you're living alone." Sarah watched his familiar movements, seeing them now through the lens of his written words. The careful way he arranged the firewood, the unconscious grace of his movements, the quiet competence that characterized everything he did, all of it seemed different now that she knew the feelings he had been hiding. "Jacob," she said suddenly before she could lose her nerve, "if you had something important to tell someone, something that might change everything between you, would you find the courage to say it?" He paused in his work, turning to look at her with those perceptive grey eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Depends on whether the telling might make things better or worse. Sometimes keeping quiet feels safer, even when it might not be right." Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she made a decision that would either bring them closer together or drive them irreparably apart. "I found your letter, Jacob. The one with my name on it." The color drained from Jacob's face, and for a moment he looked like a man who had just been told his worst fears had come to pass. He straightened slowly, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I didn't mean for you to see that," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have written it, shouldn't have kept it where you might find it. But you did write it," Sarah said, standing and crossing to where he stood frozen by the fireplace. "And I did find it. And now we both know what we've been dancing around for weeks." The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning when the first hints of autumn were beginning to touch the higher peaks with gold and crimson. Miss Murphy accepted it from the rider who brought mail and telegrams from the nearest town, her expression growing increasingly serious as she read the brief message. Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for two travelers who had stopped overnight, when Miss Murphy appeared in the doorway, holding the yellow paper with obvious reluctance. "This came for you, dear," she said gently. From back east, Sarah's hands stilled on the coffee pot as she accepted the telegram, her heart immediately beginning to race with the kind of dread that came from knowing that such messages rarely brought good news. The paper felt unnaturally heavy in her fingers as she unfolded it and read the terse word that would change everything. "Father deceased. Stop estate requires immediate attention. Stop your presence needed for legal proceedings. Stop return at once. Stop Attorney Worthington." Sarah read the message 3 times before its meaning fully penetrated the shock that seemed to have frozen her thoughts. Her father, the man who had taught her to hold a hammer properly, and who had believed his daughters should be prepared for whatever life might require of them, was gone. More than that, his death had created obligations that reached across half a continent to pull her back into a life she had worked so hard to leave behind. "Bad news?" Mrs. Murphy asked gently, though Sarah's expression had already answered her question. "My father has died," Sarah said, the words feeling strange and unreal in her mouth. "There are legal matters that require my attention. They want me to return to Philadelphia immediately." The breakfast she had been preparing suddenly seemed insignificant, the familiar routine of morning tasks rendered meaningless by this intrusion from her abandoned past. Sarah sank into a chair, still holding the telegram, trying to understand how her world could shift so completely in the space of a few printed words. Mrs. Murphy poured 2 cups of coffee and settled into the chair across from Sarah, her weathered face creased with sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss, dear. Losing a parent is never easy, no matter how prepared you think you are." "I should feel sadder," Sarah said, surprised by her own emotional numbness. "He was a good man, better than most. But I feel like I'm mourning someone from a story I heard long ago, not someone who was part of my real life." "Grief comes in its own time and its own way," Mrs. Murphy observed. "Don't judge yourself for not feeling what you think you should feel." Sarah stared at the telegram, trying to imagine herself back in Philadelphia, dressed in black mourning clothes, and sitting in some lawyer's office, while men who had never known her father discussed the distribution of his worldly goods. The very thought of returning to that world of social expectations and carefully maintained appearances made her feel physically ill. "How long do you think you'll be gone?" Mrs. Murphy asked. "I don't know. Weeks, perhaps months. It depends on how complicated the estate is, how many legal requirements there are." Sarah looked up from the telegram, sudden panic gripping her chest. "What if I can't come back? What if there are obligations that keep me there permanently?" The possibility had not occurred to her until she spoke it aloud, but now it loomed like a thundercloud on the horizon. Her father's death might not only be taking him from the world, but might also be taking her from the new life she had begun to build in Montana territory. "You'll come back," Mrs. Murphy said, with quiet certainty. "This place has gotten into your blood, and Jacob Stone has gotten into your heart. That kind of attachment doesn't just disappear because some lawyer says you're needed elsewhere." At the mention of Jacob's name, Sarah felt her composure begin to crack. How could she tell him that just as they had begun to acknowledge their feelings for each other, she was being called away to deal with the ghost of her former life? How could she explain that duty and legal obligation were conspiring to separate them just when separation felt like the cruelest possible fate? "Does Jacob know?" Mrs. Murphy asked. Sarah shook her head. "He went up to check his trap lines yesterday. He won't be back until this afternoon." The morning passed in a haze of practical preparations. Sarah packed her few belongings into the same leather satchel that had brought her to Montana territory, the irony not lost on her that the same bag might now carry her away from the only place she had felt truly at peace. Miss Murphy helped her make arrangements for passage on the next eastbound stage, which would leave from the county seat in 3 days. When Jacob finally appeared at the trading post that afternoon, Sarah was sitting on the front porch, the telegram folded and refolded in her hands until the creases threatened to tear the paper entirely. He took one look at her face and knew immediately that something fundamental had changed. Murphy waited until Sarah had retired to her room before revealing the truth she had been carrying for weeks. Jacob sat at the kitchen table, his coffee growing cold as he stared at the telegram that had shattered his carefully rebuilt world. The older woman moved about her evening tasks with unusual hesitation, clearly wrestling with some internal debate. Finally, she stopped her busy work and turned to face Jacob with the expression of someone about to deliver another blow to a man who had already taken more than his share. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something Sarah doesn't know I know, something that might help you understand why she's so frightened of going back east." Jacob looked up from the telegram, his grey eyes reflecting a pain that Mrs. Murphy recognized all too well. She had seen that same look in the mirror after her own husband's death, the expression of someone watching hope slip away despite all efforts to hold on to it. "She didn't just lose her sister to consumption," Mrs. Murphy continued, settling into the chair across from him. "There were other letters, ones that came after she'd already been here a month. I should have given them to her immediately, but something about the way they were addressed, the formal language, it didn't feel like personal correspondence." From her apron pocket, Miss Murphy withdrew 2 envelopes, their edges worn from handling, their seals long since broken. Jacob could see Sarah's name written in different hands across the front of each, the ink formal and impersonal in a way that suggested official business rather than familial affection. "I finally opened them," Mrs. Murphy admitted, her voice carrying the weight of guilt and justification in equal measure. "Told myself I needed to know if there was some danger she was running from, some threat that might follow her here and put other folks at risk." Jacob remained silent, understanding that whatever Mrs. Murphy had discovered was serious enough to justify her unprecedented breach of privacy. In the months he had known Bridget Murphy, she had proven herself to be scrupulously honest and respectful of boundaries. For her to have opened private correspondence meant she had found cause for genuine concern. "The first letter is from a woman named Catherine Pemberton," Mrs. Murphy said, unfolding the paper with obvious reluctance. "She was supposed to have been Sarah's sister-in-law, married to a man named Thomas Pemberton, who was, by all accounts, engaged to marry Sarah before she came west." Jacob felt something cold settle in his stomach as Mrs. Murphy continued reading. The letter was brief, but devastating in its implications. "Miss Matthews, your sudden departure has left our family in a most difficult position. Thomas has made every effort to contact you through proper channels, but your continued silence has forced us to conclude that you have chosen to abandon not only your engagement, but your responsibilities to our family name. The circumstances of your departure, following so closely upon the discovery of your condition, have created a scandal that extends far beyond our immediate circle. Thomas's business associates have begun to question his judgment in matters both personal and professional. We require your immediate return to address the financial obligations you incurred during your engagement, as well as to provide explanation for your abandonment of promises made before God and respectable society." Murphy set down the first letter and picked up the second, her expression growing even more troubled. This one came 2 weeks later from a lawyer representing the Pemberton family. It makes the situation even clearer. Jacob listened with growing horror as Miss Murphy read the legal language that painted Sarah as a woman who had fled Philadelphia to escape scandal and financial responsibility. According to the lawyer's letter, Sarah had been discovered to be with child during her engagement, had refused to explain the circumstances that led to her condition, and had disappeared in the night rather than face the consequences of her situation. "She lost the baby," Miss Murphy said quietly, folding both letters and returning them to her apron. "That much I was able to piece together from things she said, though she doesn't know I understand the full story. The consumption that took her sister came after she'd arrived here, but the grief that drove her west was more complicated than just losing Margaret to illness." Jacob felt the world shift beneath him as he understood the full scope of what Sarah had been carrying. She hadn't just been mourning her sister, She had been fleeing a scandal that would have destroyed her reputation, dealing with the loss of a child, and escaping an engagement to a man who was apparently more concerned with social standing than with her well-being. "Why are you telling me this?" Jacob asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because she's terrified that going back east will trap her in that old life permanently," Mrs. Murphy replied. "And because if you love her the way I think you do, you need to understand what she's really running from when that stage arrives to take her away." Jacob spent the night sitting on his front porch, Mrs. Murphy's revelations churning in his mind like storm clouds gathering over the peaks. The rifle across his knees had been cleaned and oiled twice already, his hands needing the familiar routine, while his thoughts wrestled with truth that changed everything and nothing at the same time. Sarah was leaving in 2 days. The stage would carry her back to Philadelphia, back to lawyers and legal proceedings, back to a world that had already judged her and found her wanting. The woman he had come to love, the woman who had brought light back into his carefully guarded life, would disappear into the civilized East, where men in fine clothes would decide her fate based on ledger books and property deeds. The rifle's stock was worn smooth from years of use, its metal surfaces kept free of rust through countless sessions of careful maintenance. Jacob had carried this weapon through his first difficult years in Montana Territory, had relied on it for both protection and sustenance when the wilderness had seemed determined to test his resolve. It was a tool he understood completely, a solution to problems that could be solved through decisive action. But the problem facing him now couldn't be solved with marksmanship or wilderness skill. The choice Sarah faced required courage of a different sort, entirely, the kind that involved laying one's heart open to another person and trusting them not to wound what was offered. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in familiar shades of rose and gold, Jacob made his decision. He would ride to the county seat, would intercept the eastbound stage, and would tell Sarah the truth about his feelings before distance and time conspired to make such honesty impossible. The ride to town took most of the morning, Jacob pushing his horse harder than he normally would have, driven by the fear that he might already be too late. The county seat was barely large enough to merit the name. A collection of weathered buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud whenever it rained. The stage station occupied a prominent position near the center of town, its sign advertising departure times and destinations in faded paint. Jacob tied his horse to the hitching rail and approached the station with the deliberate pace of a man who had made up his mind but wasn't entirely sure of his welcome. Through the dusty window he could see passengers waiting in the dim interior, their luggage stacked nearby in preparation for the afternoon departure. Sarah sat alone on a wooden bench near the far wall, her familiar leather satchel at her feet, her traveling dress the same dark gray she had worn upon her arrival in Montana Territory months earlier. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the prospect of returning to a world that had shown her little kindness. The stage driver was loading mail bags and supplies into the rear boot of the coach, his movements indicating that departure was still at least an hour away. Jacob stood outside the station, one hand resting on his rifle stock, gathering the courage to step inside and speak words that would either bring Sarah back to him or drive her away forever. Through the window he watched Sarah check her pocket watch, then return it to her reticule with the careful precision of someone whose life had become a series of scheduled obligations. The gesture reminded him painfully of the woman who had first arrived at Murphy's trading post, controlled, guarded, and carrying grief like a physical weight. But Jacob had seen the other Sarah too, the woman who hummed while working in the garden, who laughed at his clumsy attempts at formal conversation, who had looked at him with something approaching hope when they shared coffee on quiet mornings. That Sarah was worth fighting for, worth risking rejection and embarrassment to save. He pushed open the station door, the hinges announcing his arrival with a rusty creak that caused every head in the room to turn in his direction. Sarah looked up from her folded hands, her eyes widening with surprise and something that might have been relief. "Jacob," she said, rising from the bench with unconscious grace, "I didn't expect to see you here. Couldn't let you leave without talking," he replied, his voice rougher than usual with emotion he was trying to keep contained. Couldn't let things end the way they did yesterday, with so many words left unsaid. The other passengers were watching with the frank curiosity of people starved for entertainment, but Jacob found he didn't care about their attention. All that mattered was the woman standing before him, the woman who held his future in her hands, whether she realized it or not. "Jacob, I have to go," Sarah said quietly. "You know I have to go." "I know you think you do," he replied, stepping closer but still maintaining a respectful distance. "But I also know there are things about your situation that you haven't told me, things that might change what you think you have to do." The stage driver's call of "all aboard" echoed through the small station, like a judge's gavel, final and uncompromising. Sarah's packed trunk sat beside the coach, loaded and secured for the journey that would carry her away from everything she had come to treasure in Montana territory. The leather straps that held her belongings were tight and properly fastened, but Jacob could see her hands trembling as she reached for her traveling bag. "Sarah, wait," Jacob said, his voice carrying across the station platform with an urgency that made several passengers pause in their boarding. "Before you get on that stage, there are things you need to know, things Mrs. Murphy told me last night." Sarah's face went white as mountain snow. She understood immediately what Jacob was referring to, her carefully guarded secrets exposed by the one person she had trusted to keep them buried. The shame she had traveled halfway across a continent to escape was written plainly across her features, visible now to the man whose good opinion she valued more than her own life. "She had no right," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of horses stamping and harness leather creaking. "She had every right," Jacob replied, stepping closer, despite the curious stares of their audience. "She cares about you same as I do. She knew you were running scared, and she wanted me to understand why." The stage driver was growing impatient, checking his pocket watch and glancing meaningfully at the passengers still standing on the platform. "Folks need to make up their minds," he announced. "We've got a schedule to keep, and the next station won't wait for stragglers." Sarah lifted her chin with the dignity that had sustained her through months of whispered scandals and pointed fingers back in Philadelphia. "Whatever Mrs. Murphy told you doesn't change anything, Jacob. I still have legal obligations to fulfill. My father's estate still requires my attention. Your father's estate can wait another week," Jacob said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "But this conversation can't. Sarah, I know about Thomas Pemberton. I know about the engagement that ended, about the child you lost, about the scandal that drove you west. And I'm here to tell you that none of it matters to me." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Sarah stared at Jacob with eyes that reflected years of shame and self-recrimination, until to believe that anyone could know the full truth of her disgrace and still stand before her with love in his expression. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking with emotion she could no longer contain. "I'm not the woman you think I am. I'm not respectable, not honorable. I let myself be compromised by a man who abandoned me the moment his family learned of my condition. I fled in the night like a common criminal rather than face the consequences of my choices." "Sarah Matthews," Jacob said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had made peace with hard truths. "You are exactly the woman I think you are. You're brave enough to start over when your old life became unbearable. You're strong enough to build something new from nothing but determination and hope. You're kind enough to bring light into the life of a broken-down mountain man who thought he was done with happiness." The stage driver climbed up to his seat, reins in hand, clearly preparing to depart with or without his remaining passenger. Other travelers had taken their seats inside the coach, their faces pressed to windows as they watched the drama unfolding on the platform. "The child wasn't Thomas's," Sarah said suddenly, the words torn from her like a confession under torture. There was a man, someone who took advantage when I was vulnerable after my mother's death. Thomas knew, his family knew. They were willing to overlook it for the sake of appearances, but when I lost the baby, they no longer had any reason to tolerate the scandal I represented." Jacob felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest as he understood the full scope of what Sarah had endured. She hadn't just been abandoned by a fiancé, she had been victimized. then blamed for her own victimization, then cast aside when she was no longer useful to people who had never truly cared for her well-being. Then Thomas Pemberton was a fool, Jacob said with quiet intensity, and his family were worse than fools. They threw away the finest woman they'll ever know because they cared more about what other people thought than about what was right. Last call, the stage driver shouted. Lady, you're either coming or you're staying, but I can't wait any longer. Sarah looked at her trunk, loaded and ready for the journey back to everything she had tried so hard to escape. Then she looked at Jacob, standing before her with his heart laid bare, offering her something she had never dared to hope for. Acceptance without conditions, love without judgment. I love you, Sarah, Jacob said simply. I love everything about who you are and who you're becoming. Stay with me, let me be the man who makes you smile again. Sarah's trunk came down from the stage with a thud that seemed to echo her heart's decision. The driver muttered something unflattering about indecisive passengers, but Jacob pressed a coin into his hand that improved his disposition considerably. The other travelers watched through the coach windows as the drama reached its resolution, some with annoyance at the delay, others with the satisfaction of witnessing a story that would provide entertainment for miles to come. Standing on the platform with her belongings once again at her feet, Sarah felt the weight of her old life settling back onto her shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome coat. Jacob had said the words she had never dared to hope anyone would speak, that he loved her despite knowing the worst of her secrets. But saying such words in the heat of emotion and living with their implications through all the ordinary days ahead were two very different things. You say that now, Sarah said quietly, watching the stage pull away in a cloud of dust that seemed to carry her last chance at respectability with it. But what happens when we're back home and you have time to really think about what you've taken on? What happens when people ask questions about my past? About why I came west alone? Jacob stepped closer, his hands reaching for hers with the same gentleness he used when handling delicate garden seedlings. Sarah, look at me, he said, waiting until her eyes met his before continuing. I'm not a man who speaks without thinking. I've had months to consider what you mean to me, weeks to understand that whatever brought you to Montana territory was less important than the woman you've become since arriving. From his shirt pocket, Jacob withdrew something Sarah had never seen before. A simple gold ring, obviously handmade, its surface bearing the subtle irregularities that spoke of craftsmanship rather than mass production. The band was warm from being carried close to his heart, and Sarah could see where he had worked the metal with patient skill to achieve its smooth finish. I made this during the long evenings when you were working late at the trading post, Jacob said, offering the ring with hands that trembled slightly despite his outward calm. Made it from gold I've been saving since my first year here. Gold I panned from the creek that runs through my property. Figured if I was ever blessed enough to find someone worth offering it to, it should be something I created with my own hands. Sarah stared at the ring, understanding its significance not just as a symbol of Jacob's intentions, but as proof of the time and thought he had invested in their future. This wasn't an impulsive gesture born of the moment's emotion. This was the culmination of careful planning and patient hope. The woman who wore my mother's ring is gone, Sarah said, touching the gold band she still wore from her sister Margaret's broken engagement. The woman who was supposed to marry Thomas Pemberton and live a respectable life in Philadelphia society no longer exists. Are you certain you want to marry whoever I've become instead? Jacob smiled then, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him since the telegram's arrival had shattered their peaceful world. Sarah Matthews, I fell in love with exactly who you are now, not who you used to be or who others think you should become. I love the woman who hums while she works, who isn't afraid to get her hands dirty, who sees beauty in simple things like wildflowers and mountain sunrises. With deliberate ceremony, Sarah removed Margaret's ring from her finger, the gold band that had bound her to sorrow and regret for longer than she cared to remember. She held it for a moment, understanding that removing it meant finally releasing her grip on a past that had brought her nothing but pain. Margaret would approve, she said softly, slipping the ring into her reticule. She always said I deserved to be loved for who I truly was, not for who I pretended to be. Jacob's hands were steady as he slipped his handmade ring onto Sarah's finger, the gold warm and comfortable as if it had been waiting her entire life to find its proper place. The fit was perfect, neither too tight nor too loose, evidence of the careful attention Jacob had paid to every detail of their relationship. "There'll be paperwork to handle back east," Sarah said practically, even as her heart soared with possibilities she had thought lost forever. "Legal matters that can't be ignored indefinitely. Then we'll handle them together," Jacob replied. "As husband and wife, if you'll have me. Partners in whatever comes next." Sarah looked down at her hand, at the ring that represented not just Jacob's love, but his faith in their shared future. For the first time since receiving news of her father's death, she felt something other than dread when she thought about the obligations waiting for her in Philadelphia. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jacob Stone. And yes, we'll face whatever comes next together." The wedding took place 3 weeks later on a crisp October morning, when the aspen trees had turned the mountainsides into sheets of living gold. Mrs. Murphy had transformed the trading post's main room into something resembling a chapel, moving aside merchandise to create an aisle between rows of chairs, borrowed from neighbors who lived scattered throughout the valley. Sarah stood before the small mirror in her upstairs room, smoothing the simple blue dress she had chosen for the occasion. It was not white. She had forfeited the right to white silk and orange blossoms years ago in Philadelphia, but it was new, sewn by her own hands from fabric Jacob had specially ordered from Denver. The blue was the color of mountain sky on a clear day, practical enough for frontier life, but beautiful enough to honor the significance of the promises she was about to make. In her hands, Sarah held Margaret's Bible, the leather cover worn soft by years of faithful use. Her sister had carried this book through her final illness, finding comfort in familiar verses when physical pain made sleep impossible. The pages were marked with pressed flowers Margaret had collected during happier times, delicate petals that had somehow retained their color and form despite the years. Sarah opened the Bible to the passage Margaret had marked with a blue ribbon, reading the words her sister had underlined in careful pencil, and Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest I will go, and where thou lodgest I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." The verses seemed especially appropriate today, as Sarah prepared to pledge herself not just to Jacob, but to the life they would build together in this mountain country. She was choosing to make Montana Territory her permanent home, to cast her lot with people who measured worth by character rather than social position. A soft knock at her door announced Mrs. Murphy's arrival. The older woman entered wearing her best dress, a dark green wool that brought out the warmth in her eyes, her graying hair carefully styled for the occasion. "Time to go, dear," Mrs. Murphy said gently. "Jacob's waiting downstairs, and I think if we delay much longer, he might start pacing a hole in my floor." Sarah smiled, imagining Jacob's nervous energy as he waited to formalize the promises they had already made to each other in their hearts. "Mrs. Murphy, I want to thank you for taking me in, for keeping my secrets, for caring enough to meddle when meddling was what I needed most." "Nonsense," Mrs. Murphy replied, though her eyes were bright with emotion. "You and Jacob found each other all on your own. I just provided the coffee and a place to do it." Downstairs, the trading post had been transformed beyond recognition. Wildflowers gathered from the high meadows decorated every available surface, their bright colors a defiant celebration of life's persistence, even as winter approached. The scent of pine boughs mixed with coffee and fresh bread, creating an atmosphere that was both festive and comfortably familiar. Jacob stood at the front of the makeshift aisle, wearing a new shirt Sarah had never seen before. Crisp white cotton that emphasized his dark coloring and made him look younger somehow, less weathered by solitude and loss. His hair had been carefully trimmed, his beard neatened, but his eyes held the same gentle intensity that had first captured Sarah's attention months ago. Beside him stood the circuit preacher who visited the valley twice yearly, a weathered man named Reverend Williams, who had agreed to perform the ceremony during his autumn rounds. The preacher's own well-worn Bible lay open on Miss Murphy's counter, ready to provide the official framework for promises that had already been tested by storm and separation. The small gathering of wedding guests represented the closest thing to family that either Sarah or Jacob had in this part of the world. Neighbors from surrounding homesteads had made the journey to witness their union, faces that had become familiar during Sarah's months at the trading post. These were people who understood that community meant showing up for life's important moments, regardless of convenience or weather. As Sarah walked down the improvised aisle, Margaret's Bible clutched in her hands, she felt her sister's presence like a blessing. Margaret would have loved Jacob, would have approved of this simple ceremony that honored love without demanding elaborate display. The blue ribbon in the Bible caught the morning light streaming through the trading post windows, seeming to glow with approval. Jacob's face lit up as Sarah approached, his expression reflecting wonder that she had chosen him, despite all the safer, more conventional options her beauty and intelligence might have secured. When she reached his side, he offered his arm with the formal courtesy he brought to all significant occasions, and Sarah felt the rightness of the moment settle around them like a warm cloak. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Williams began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had witnessed love triumph over hardship in countless frontier communities. "We are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Spring arrived early to the mountains that year, bringing with it the kind of gentle warmth that made Sarah believe in new beginnings with a fervor that surprised her. She stood in Jacob's expanded cabin, their cabin now, watching him work at his latest project, wood shavings curling away from the careful strokes of his carving knife like pale golden ribbons. The cradle taking shape beneath Jacob's patient hands was more than just furniture. Each curve had been planned with the precision of an architect, each joint fitted with the care of someone who understood that some creations must last for generations. The headboard bore a simple pattern of carved flowers, not roses or lilies that might wilt, but the sturdy mountain blooms that had decorated their wedding: Indian paintbrush and lupine, columbine and beargrass. "You're getting ahead of yourself," Sarah said gently, settling into the chair beside his workbench with a cup of coffee. Her hand moved unconsciously to rest on her still flat stomach, where new life was just beginning to make itself known through morning queasiness and an overwhelming need for afternoon naps. Jacob looked up from his carving, his grey eyes bright with the kind of hope Sarah had never expected to see in a man who had buried his own child. "Maybe," he admitted, running his thumb over the smooth wood grain, "but a man likes to be prepared for blessings, especially when he's waited so long to receive them." The months since their wedding had passed like pages in a book. Sarah was reluctant to finish. The legal matters back east had been resolved through correspondence and a capable attorney, her father's modest estate settled without requiring her physical presence. The Pemberton family's threats had evaporated when faced with Jacob's letters, written in his careful, measured prose, letters that made it clear Sarah was now under the protection of a man who would not be intimidated by social posturing or legal bluster. Winter had been kind to them, the snows deep enough to create a cocoon of privacy around their mountain home, but not so harsh as to threaten their supplies or safety. Sarah had learned to read weather signs in cloud formations and wind patterns, had discovered muscles she never knew she possessed through the daily tasks of frontier life, had found a strength she hadn't known she carried. But it was the quiet evenings that had truly transformed her. Evenings spent beside the fire, while Jacob worked on various projects, and Sarah mended clothes or read aloud from books they shared. They had developed the easy rhythm of couples who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, who could spend hours together without needing constant conversation to fill the spaces between words. "Tell me about Daniel again," Sarah said, watching Jacob's hands shape the wood with movements that seemed almost reverential. "What was he like at bedtime?" Jacob's smile carried sadness, but no longer the sharp edge of unbearable grief. Time and Sarah's love had gentled those memories, allowing him to speak of his lost son without the fear that remembering would destroy him completely. He had this way of negotiating, Jacob said, his carving knife following the curve of a flower petal with perfect precision. Would ask for one more story, then one more song, then one more kiss goodnight. Mary used to say he could stretch bedtime into a production that would make theatre folks jealous. Sarah closed her eyes, imagining the scene Jacob painted. A small boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, determined to squeeze every possible moment from each day. The image brought no jealousy or inadequacy, only a gentle sadness for the child who had lived too briefly and the parents who had loved him completely. "You think he would have liked the idea of a little brother or sister?" Sarah asked. Jacob set down his carving knife, considering the question with the seriousness he brought to all matters concerning their future. "Daniel was the kind of boy who saw possibilities everywhere," he said finally. He would have been excited about teaching someone smaller than himself how to catch fireflies and find the best climbing trees. Would have appointed himself the chief protector of any baby who came into his world. The cradle was nearly finished, its construction solid enough to last through multiple children, beautiful enough to become a family heirloom passed down through generations of mountain-dwelling descendants. Jacob had built it large enough to accommodate the vigorous growth of a healthy infant, but small enough to fit beside their bed during those early months when new parents needed to hear every breath and sigh. "It's beautiful work," Sarah said, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Our child will be lucky to sleep in something made with such love." Jacob's hand covered hers on the cradle's rail, his calloused palm warm and steady. "Our children," he corrected gently. "This cradle is built to serve a growing family, God willing." Outside their cabin, spring was painting the mountain slopes in shades of green. Sarah was still learning to name, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of snow melting into the streams that would feed the summer garden. 1 year later, Sarah sat in the garden behind their cabin, her hands resting on her rounded belly, where their child moved with increasing vigor as autumn painted the mountains in familiar shades of gold and crimson. The baby was due before the first snows, and Sarah felt the same mixture of anticipation and contentment that she imagined the earth must feel just before harvest time. At her feet lay a basket of late-season vegetables, the last tomatoes of the year, their red globes heavy with the concentrated sweetness that came from growing slowly through mountain summers, squash that would keep them fed through the winter months, and carrots that had grown sweet and tender in soil enriched by 2 years of careful tending. Jacob emerged from the cabin carrying 2 cups of coffee, moving with the careful attentiveness of a man who had learned to anticipate his wife's needs without being asked. He settled beside her on the bench he had built specifically for these quiet moments, when the day's work was done and the evening light turned everything golden. "Letter came today," he said, handing her the coffee and withdrawing an envelope from his shirt pocket. "From Philadelphia." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, though such letters no longer carried the power to shatter her peace entirely. The handwriting on the envelope was formal but not threatening, and the return address indicated a law firm she didn't recognize. She opened the letter carefully, reading its contents twice, before fully understanding the implications of what she held. When she looked up at Jacob, her eyes were bright with something that might have been wonder. "Thomas Pemberton is dead," she said simply. "Died 6 months ago from pneumonia. His family's lawyer is writing to inform me that all legal claims against my father's estate have been withdrawn, and to apologize for any distress their previous correspondence may have caused." Jacob accepted the letter, reading it with the careful attention he brought to any document that might affect their life together. When he finished, he folded it neatly and handed it back to Sarah. "How do you feel about that?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Sarah considered the question seriously, exploring her emotional response to news that would have devastated or delighted her during different periods of her life. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she felt mostly indifferent to Thomas Pemberton's fate, as if he were a character from a story she had read long ago and half forgotten. "I feel free," she said finally, "not because he's dead, but because his death officially closes a chapter that I'd already finished writing in my heart." She pulled writing materials from the basket beside her chair. Paper, pen and ink that Jacob kept properly maintained for the correspondence that was part of their life as married homesteaders. The letter she began to compose was addressed to her old neighbors in Philadelphia, the few people who had shown her kindness during her darkest days there. "Dear Miss Hartwell," she wrote in the careful script their mother had taught both daughters during long winter evenings that now seemed to belong to another lifetime. "I hope this letter finds you in good health and spirits. I am writing from Montana Territory, where I have made my home with my husband, Jacob Stone. We live in the mountains west of the county seat, where Jacob homesteaded several years ago, and where we have built a life that brings us both great contentment. I wanted you to know that I am expecting our first child before winter, and that the grief which drove me from Philadelphia has been replaced by a happiness I never dared to hope for. Jacob is a good man who sees only the woman I have become, not the scandals that once defined me in the eyes of polite society. Our life here is simple, but rich in ways that are difficult to explain. We grow our own food, make our own entertainment, and find our greatest joy in the quiet rhythms of the seasons and the satisfaction of work well done. I have learned to judge my worth by my own standards, rather than by the opinions of others, and I sleep peacefully knowing that I am loved for exactly who I am. Please give my regards to anyone who asks after me, and know that while I treasure the kindness you showed me during difficult times, I am content to let my old life remain in the past, where it belongs. With warm regards and gratitude, Sarah Stone," as she signed her married name with a flourish that would have made their old penmanship teacher proud. Sarah felt something settle inside her chest, a sense of completion that had nothing to do with Thomas Pemberton's death and everything to do with finally becoming the woman she was meant to be. Jacob read the letter when she offered it, his smile growing wider with each paragraph. "That's exactly right," he said when he finished. "That's exactly who you are." The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting their little valley in the golden light that had become as familiar as breathing, and somewhere in the distance, Sarah could hear the sound of wild geese calling as they flew south for the winter.